Hello and what is shaking, everybody? Welcome to the Wind Up podcast. I'm your host, Mike of MTGA Wines, and it is our September Q&A episode. Feels like the end of this month came really fast. In this episode, we'll be diving into some of the questions that you all have submitted to us. Also, a couple that we talked about with a few tastings we hosted this month. We're going to cover everything from harvest, a little bit more wine business stuff, winemaking. We got a bunch to pack into this episode. Before we get into it, number one, thank you all once again for sharing, subscribing to, liking the show here. Please continue to do so and share it with your wine-loving friends. You can find it typically wherever podcasts can be found. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I believe, and on YouTube. You can find the video format of this where you get to see me dance around in my office. So much fun. You can also follow us on all of our social networks at MTGA Wines. We are most active on YouTube as well as Instagram. You can also find us on the social network formerly known as Twitter and the Book of Face. At MTGA will be at MTGA Wines will be our handle for all of those. Also, for those of you that are regular listeners to the podcast, if anyone has a quick hot second to leave a rating or a review wherever you're consuming the podcast, that'll be hugely helpful in kind of getting it out into the algorithm and making it easier for people to find. It actually goes a really long way. That's how a lot of them work. So if you have a quick second to leave a quick star rating or review, just a couple of short lines of what you like and maybe even critiques if there's anything you want to see improved on the show, we'll definitely take that as well. For episodes such as this where we answer your questions, you can submit your questions through any of our social networks. Just slide on into our DMs with what you want to know more about, and we'll dive into it. You can also head to our website, mtgawines.com. Scroll down on the homepage. There's a little email form that you can fill out to submit as many questions as you would like to have answered. We'll try and fit as many as we can in to these episodes. Last but certainly not least, two more announcements as far as our wines go. We are in the midst of our Fall Wine Club release. For those of you that are in our wine club, you should have received an email heads up from me by this stage. If you haven't seen it yet, please check your spam filters and get in touch with us if you don't see anything coming through. We're going to start shipping out shipments here in the next week or so. On top of that, we are also going to be hitting the road big time come this October as well as November. The HBIC herself is going to be in Dallas. She's going to be in Austin. She's going to be in Nash Vegas. I am headed to Missouri. I'm probably going to be in Springfield, Kansas City, and St. Louis during the first or second week of November. Then I'm heading to Charlotte, Atlanta, and Tampa. For those last three events, we have tickets available. Currently, you can head to our website, mtgawines.com/shop, or just head to our website, click on the shop thing on the upper bar thing, whatever there. You can find tickets to the Charlotte event, the Atlanta event, as well as the Tampa event. We only have a couple dozen tickets to each spot available. There are going to be multiple of us wineries. Realistically, it's close to like $500 worth of tasting fees, not to mention a plane ticket, a hotel room, and all the other stuff that you would normally spend it just to get out to Napa and visit some of these wineries. You get to come and taste through all these wines for $125. It's going to be outrageous. There's going to be at least 24 different wines there from 6 different wineries. It's going to be a ball. Some of you have attended these events before. They're an absolute blast to get to know some of our newer wines, some of our older wines, and even some new producers that hopefully you fall in love with. So please check out our website for more tickets, more event information, or send us a quick DM or an email, and we'll fill in the details as best we can. All right, that's enough announcements. The announcements they're always a lot this time of year because we just got a lot going on. So I appreciate you all bearing with me. Now let's dive into the first question, probably the most poignant question we have when it comes to this season that we're in. And that is, let's timestamp it real quick. How is the 2024 harvest season looking thus far? Can we expect a good year? Long story short, it's looking really good, and you can expect a good year. I think what's interesting about this season, and maybe I'm getting the cart in front of the horse a little bit there, because these wines are still babies. We still got a long way to go to see how they're going to develop. And there are a couple of like caveats I want to add to that answer. But overall, the biggest thing I'm seeing is great concentration, great flavor. The structure is really, really intense. The tannins are a little rougher this year. It seems like we're getting a little bit more kind of intense seed tannin extraction, which can be that really like chalky feeling that you get in some wines. They are a lot more intense than your skin tannins that you extract from the grapes. But those are pretty intense, which has been kind of true across the board. The white wines that we are in, and they're already done, in essence, they've now started their aging process, are just beautiful. The white wines are just outrageous this year. They're so good. The red wines are also really holding on to their acidity. We just tested the pH level on our Cabernet Sauvignon. For this time of the season, it's still really low compared to what we would expect, and the sugar's a little bit higher than I would expect with such a low pH. But that actually really plays into my hand as a winemaker, because my calling card of my wines are, kind of more acid-driven, refreshing styles. So, like, for this year, like, I'm lined up to knock it down. The caveat that I want to mention is that the word on the street, for some reason, for many producers, is that they're done already. In fact, the word on that was the word on the street last week. So during like the third week of this month, I was hearing from a ton of people that they're like, "Oh yeah, everything's in, we're done." And I'm like, based on all the flavors I'm tasting, even the numbers I'm seeing, even though I'm not a make wine by the numbers guy, I'm like, outside of a couple of producers that want that kind of leaner, kind of old school style, it's really surprising that people are done. But there are like a lot of my immediate colleagues that are like, yeah, we're basically like 10% in. We've got at least another month and a half ahead of us. This season's going to drag on for a while still. So there's like this weird variability, and I can't quite put a finger on it. I can't quite get like a great like synopsis of what's going on and why people were harvesting so early. My gut instinct was that at the beginning of September, we had this like little bit of a heat wave, and people kind of got a little gun shy and started just picking because they maybe were afraid things were going to get really overripe like they did in 2022 for some people, or they're going to see a lot of, degradation or desecration like out in the vineyard when it came to like the fruit, and they were just like, we got to bring it in because we don't want it to like go bad. Like the quality for us still looks really, really good. I don't know. Like that's like my one thing. Like I'm still trying to figure out kind of where everyone else is at, because I'm getting a lot of different answers from people that are like on opposite ends of the spectrum. There are very few of us right now. Like for us, we're like halfway through. This podcast is coming out on September 25th. We're like halfway through our harvest, which is pretty much where I would expect it to be right now. A lot of our grapes are going to come in. The last like big batch of grapes are probably going to come in next week, and we'll almost be done by the end of October. So things are kind of lining up for what is like a normal year for us. It's really weird that a lot of people were harvesting so early. The folks that are harvesting later, a lot of people like up on the mountains, they're working with cooler climate sites. Like that makes sense. It's all those other folks that picked already. I'm like, I don't really know what's going on. Regardless, they're going to make their own decisions, kind of figure it out and do what's best for them. From what I'm seeing so far, what I've tasted so far, the wines are going to be awesome. They are going to be very, very structured. It seems like this is kind of a repeat of the 2018 vintage for us, where it was kind of this like just solid year, but the wines were just beasts. They were just like, okay, these are going to take some time to really like settle down and come to their own. So I would totally expect a good year. It's just going to take some time for these wines to kind of get into their groove. I mean, we're talking about red wines that are like 2 weeks old at best right now. So there's a long way to go before we're really going to know exactly how this harvest is going to shake down. But Mother Nature's not throwing us any curveballs. It's been a little warmer like lately, but that's actually been great because these cooler vineyard sites are like kicking along and ripening up perfectly. So even with a little bit of heat more recently, we are cruising. Loving where this 2024 vintage is going so far. All right, moving right along. Question number 2. All right, going back to last week's episode, I knew this was going to come up again, and I'm glad it is because this is going to be a great part of the conversation. After the grape pricing episode last week, how could that affect the price of wines when they hit the market? Excellent question. I'm going to bring up a calculator for this one because we're going to need it. Let me move some stuff around here real quick. Let me get another notepad here real quick. Hopefully you'll be able to see this for those that are watching. For those that are listening, this might be a little tougher. So let me shrink my camera down there. All right, we got our notepad. I'm just going to be like writing stuff down here. The calculator's up. I'm going to try and explain it as we go so you don't necessarily have to pay attention to what's going on screen, but let's do it. So we mentioned in last week's episode that there's just some great deals right now for Napa, let's say Cabernet, for example, because there's a huge oversupply right now and just not enough demand. So you see grape prices taking a huge hit. I mentioned in last week's episode that if you're going to see any big changes when it comes to how wines are priced, it's not going to happen until those wines are getting into bottle, which means 2-3 years down the line, realistically. So while we see kind of these numbers within the industry, and it's like, oh my God, there's this crazy kind of gut reaction. Remember, this is an industry that is like the long game. You have to think many, many years ahead to see how things are actually going to pan out. And there are a lot of other factors at play. So what I want to do to kind of answer this question is kind of break down like the price of a bottle of wine and like show what this could potentially mean. All right. So to get started, whoops, got excited there. So you'll see on the calculator here, the average price, 2024 average price of Cab Sauv. Whoop, there we go. Was $9,000 a ton. You know what that equals? That equals about, which is about 600 bottles of wine. Boom. Now, let's put that in perspective, which is easy to do. Divide that 9,000 by 600 bottles. Easy math. $15 per bottle is the cost of just the grapes. Keep in mind that $9,000 price, and I've said this in many episodes, is only for the cost of the grapes, right? There's no other labor involved. There's no rent. There's no barrels. There's no nothing. That is purely the input cost for just the fruit that we're dealing with. Now, let's say we have a couple of these years back to back where the demand is super low and the supply is super high. And we see, a big drop in grape prices. Let's just say that happens. Let's say they drop by a third, like a big old number, right? And it goes down to $6,000 per ton, right? That means if you divide by the same 600, you're down to $10. Whoops, you're down to $10. I totally messed up that calculator. Totally messed it up again. 1, 2, 3 divided by 6, 1, 2. There we go. Okay, $10 a bottle. This is what happens when I try and do show and tell on the show. All right, so let's say, and that's a net difference, right, of $5. There you go. Can't even spell difference today. So let's pretend for a second that your retail price of that bottle of wine equals $120. This is a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, right? $120 for that bottle of wine. If we're making this wine using the 2024 average and kind of utilizing what, kind of a basic like retail model of Keystone pricing, that means if your retail price is $120, it cost $60 to make, right? Because what you're going to do with this Keystone pricing that I just mentioned, for those that might not be familiar what this is you're basically just doubling the cost of what it was. So if me, the wine producer, if I'm spending $60 to make a bottle of wine, I'm going to charge you, the consumer, $120. That way I can pay for the one that I made, right? And I can produce another one. And that would help my business scale up. Or maybe, I'm going to just keep that as profits or whatever. Again, this is all just kind of hypothetical numbers here because this is a huge like generalization. But let's just say that's the case. So that equals a 50% margin, right? So 50%. And that's a beautiful number. It would never happen. And it never happens unless you're doing certain things. But we're going to talk about that way later in a different episode. That's a whole nother can of worms we're getting into. Let's just use this as the example. Okay. So, in this example, $15 would be part of that cost, right? And the remaining $45 would be all the other COG inputs, right? In this situation. Now, if we see this big price decrease in grapes, where it goes from $15 a bottle for the grapes to $10 a bottle for the grapes, right? You see that $5 difference. So your cost would go down to, you guessed it, $55 a bottle for that cost, which means theoretically, if all your other cost inputs and everything else stayed the same, if we were living in a utopia and you didn't see a cost increase in any other way, shape, or form, there were no other factors that you had to account for, that wine, if you're using that same Keystone pricing, would be $110 a bottle. So you would see that savings, in essence, be passed on to the consumer. You guys, theoretically, if we are living in a perfect world and this hypothetical winery wasn't going to, just keep the same retail price for the sake of keeping the same retail price. But as I mentioned, this is a bit of a utopia, right? So you're looking at this cost, right? And you're like, okay, cost of the grapes is $10. So let's back that out. So everything else is $45. Let's say your labels, your corks, your foils, your glass, your barrels, storage, like anything else that could be associated with the cost of goods that go to make that wine. Because remember, the cost of just the grapes is $10, as we see here on the calculator, right? So let's back that out. So $45, theoretically, if we were going to see this price decrease in the wine, that would be all the other stuff. But here's the rub, is that we're still seeing the cost of everything else rise around us. In fact, I think our costs so far this year are up another somewhere between 10 and 15%. It's a lot, and it's a lot to bear. So let's just say the costs are up 10%, right? So you take that 45 times 0.1, that's an additional 4.5 per bottle that we're spending this year compared to what we might have spent in prior years, right? So let's add that to that $45 thing, right? Boom. Again, this is a huge generalization, but hopefully we'll provide some light into what could go on here. So now, before you add in the cost of the grapes, your cost of this bottle of wine is $49.50. Okay. Now let's add in the $10 it cost you just for the grapes. You're at $59.50. Okay. The original cost was $60, giving you a $120 retail price. The new cost with this price adjustment for the grapes, but the increase in cost of everything else is $59.50. So realistically, if you're going to use that same Keystone pricing model, you're going to end up with a $119 bottle of wine versus a $120 bottle of wine. And is a wine producer going to give you that dollar and price their wine at $119? My initial instinct is probably not. Because that $1 is, in the grand scheme, it's a less than, less than 1% difference in the overall price. So they're probably just going to opt to keep it at $120 and not worry about changing prices on you. So when we talked about that episode and how pricing could change and whether or not we're going to see pricing decrease for Napa wines, there are a lot of things at play. And this hopefully kind of illustrated it. Hopefully, that was kind of a whirlwind of math right there. But hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of why it is still going to be unlikely that you're going to see like some big price drop off, or it could be unlikely. We could see demand for wine continue to drop. We could see sales continue to drop. You could see the grapes and everything else start to continue to reduce in price. But it's going to need to happen for everything, not just the grapes. And it's going to need to happen over the course of many, many years in order for this pricing to kind of correct itself and get to a point where producers like us could provide you a wine at a lower price point. Because even though the fruit itself decreases in price, you can see here that if the other costs, still go up, there's not a huge difference in what that retail price is going to end up being. So I hate to kind of be the bearer of bad news on this, because this is, in my opinion, this is realistically going to be kind of how it shakes down, is that you're going to see perhaps some more affordable wines. You might see some price adjustments here, there, but it's not going to be super prevalent because there's a lot of other stuff going into what we do. We are still coming out of the most expensive time to be making wine in Napa that has ever been, period. That's just how it is. So if we're going to see a correction, and if we're going to see pricing actually go down when it comes to the bottles of wine y'all are, thankfully so in love with and support us, by purchasing our bottles, it's going to take years of market correction to get to that point. That is the way of the road, because realistically, we're still seeing, inflation. It's obviously a lot less than what it was. We just saw that the Fed reducing rates and all that stuff. They're, starting to kind of account for less inflation and getting it to what their standard is of 2%. But that still means the cost of stuff is going up slowly but surely, but just at a slower rate. So if the cost of everything is still continuing to rise, you're still going to see, relatively the same pricing. In fact, you might even see price increases. Even though the fruit is cheaper, you might see the cost of everything else go up, and they have to account for that. It could be a 20% increase in all those other goods that you need to utilize for winemaking. And so you end up with, a bottle of wine that's $125 or $130 a bottle, rather than seeing a price decrease. The tough part about this conversation is that, the fruit obviously is a very expensive cost center for us. It's the second biggest, it's the biggest one typically. Barrels are typically number 2, if I'm not mistaken. But there's so many other inputs. And if all of those are still rising, well, even though the grapes settle or even decrease, that might just negate that difference. So, how is this going to affect the price of wines when they hit the market? Kind of long story longer. Probably not going to. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I honestly don't think it's going to, unless we continue to see kind of year after year. This is the kind of big if, is that if we continue to see year after year low demand and high supply, that is what you're going to see. But you're going to need a few years of that to actually make some moves and see a big difference. So I hope that kind of answers it. I know that probably listening to that episode last week, it probably provided a lot of ooh, there's going to be some great deals on wine soon, kind of attitude. It yet to be seen. This is a long-term industry. Things don't turn on a dime like that because it takes us years to produce these wines. And if you're going to see something like a price decrease, across the board when it comes to Napa, there's going to have to be a lot of craziness that happens and a very high supply and a very low demand for that to actually start to correct itself. So that is realistically where I think grape pricing and the price of wines is going to be, is that you're probably not going to see much of a difference. You might see pricing stagnate for a little bit. It might stay steadier. That's probably the best case scenario right now. I think it's a really big if. I really doubt you're going to see pricing decrease realistically. All right. That is enough math for today. That almost broke my brain. All right, no more math. We're closing that out. Okay. Question number 3. All right. Oh, this is such a good one. This will be a little bit more lighthearted, which is nice. That second one was a little intense. All right. When we go wine tasting, or when friends bring wine over for a gathering, how can you politely tell someone you don't like that wine? So this is always a point of contention, right? Because you can definitely rub someone the wrong way, especially if it's a guest bringing over some wine. You also, if you're sitting at a tasting at a winery and you're sitting with a host or someone like myself who happens to be the owner of the winemaker, you're not a huge fan of the wine, or maybe you're just talking casually about certain wines and, what you like and what you don't like. You just kind of have to say it. just kind of grin. You either grin and bear it and you suck it up and you dump it out and move on to the next thing the first chance you get when they're not looking, or you just tell them how it is and be like, yeah, I'm not really a huge fan. In my experience, what helps me, like if someone's sitting at the tasting table with me and we're going through our lineup, it helps me personally to be like, hey, if I ask someone like, what do you think? Because it's easy to tell if someone's like not enjoying what's in their glass. And it happens not often, but often enough that you learn kind of the cues. And my first question is like, what do you think of that? And I definitely put like a certain tone on it. And they're like, and it's normally like they start with like a little hum or something. They're like, like it's just not, hitting me the right way. And I'm like, and I start trying to kind of pry for a little bit of information. It's the, like, what don't you like? It seems like it's kind of hitting your taste buds a weird way. Like what, you're unsure about this wine. Like, what is it about it that you're unsure about? Is it the acidity? Is it the fruit characteristics? Is the barrel impact a little too heavy? And I kind of like paint like a broad stroke picture there to kind of dial in, like, what is it that you don't like? That way I can try and find a wine that you do like. So if a friend comes over and I'm not a huge fan of a wine, typically I just tell them, I'm like, I don't really like this wine because of, like, it's not flawed, it's not faltered, like it's well made, but I don't like this characteristic. It's too acidic, or it's too tannic, or it's too alcoholic, or it's too fruity or jammy. Like you get kind of key in on something that's just like not hitting you the right way. That way it's relatable, because if if there's a friend of mine that loves like juicy jammy Zinfandel and it's not my thing, I'd be like, dude, like, like I don't like this style of wine. It just isn't mine. Like it's not for me. Like you're welcome. Like I'll try a little bit because I'm curious to try it and see what it tastes like. And maybe it's one I do like, but I'm probably not going to go back for seconds. Right? Kind of how it is. I actually got into a really great conversation with a colleague a couple weeks back. And we were talking about like this topic, but as it comes to like big producers and everybody from like a Camus or a Silver Oak and or even what Gallo does, with like a Barefoot, or what the Prisoner Wine Company does, which like these are all wines that are, made and people enjoy them, and that's great. Good on you. And we got on the topic and he's like, between like, because he's a master somm. And he's like, the amount of times I've had to like talk about like Camus or Bella Gloss and like No Harm No Foul, they've done really well and people love these wines and they've introduced people to other wines. Like you got to give them a little bit of respect. But I'm like, people ask me my opinion of them and I'm like, I don't want to tell them I'm not a huge fan, but I need to find a way to, describe it in a way that would be like, they're just not for me, and like be cool about it, which is totally fine. And we were trying to like spitball ways of like, hey, here's how I do it. It was kind of the same advice of like, I just kind of pick out that one characteristic that I'm not a huge fan of, and I just say it's not for me. I know a lot of other people love it. And like in this example of like a Camus or Bella Gloss, like typically those wines, like for me personally, are just a little too sweet. Doesn't mean they're bad wines, doesn't mean they're not well made, doesn't mean that other people can't enjoy them for what they are. But for me personally, they're not my thing because they're just a little too sweet tasting. And I don't know if that's actual sugar content in there because I haven't run labs on it. I don't know if maybe they're just a little bit more alcoholic and it kind of gives it that air of sweetness, or they're later harvest and really juicy. Without seeing like the chemistry or knowing exactly how they're made, I can't make, an educated judgment on it. But I can tell you what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing and be like, yeah, it's maybe just not for me. There are other wines I would rather drink. No harm, no foul. I'm not offended by when people tell me that about wines, when something I make is, not for them. That's totally cool. In fact, I prefer it. That way I can try and find something in our lineup that someone would like. So, realistically here, if you're going wine tasting or someone brings over a wine that you're just not a huge fan of, honesty is the best policy. Just tell them how it is. Do it respectfully, unless they're a good friend, then talk all that shit you want, of course. But try and kind of pick out that one thing that's like maybe just not for you. And that way, the next time they come over, or if you bring a wine over to their house, you both know kind of what wines you're into and what wines you're not into. And that way you can find a little bit of something for everybody the next time you go shopping for wine or the next time you go wine tasting. That's probably the best way to go about it, I think. All righty. Moving right along. Question number 4. So, we got a good social media question here. All right, on your Instagram page, you were making wine in what looked like plastic bins. Why not use stainless steel tanks or barrels? So, I wouldn't say this is like a point of contention or anything, but it's definitely a stylistic choice. Now, for when I started making wine, 15 years ago, the lots that we were making were so small that we didn't have a stainless steel tank that was small enough. We didn't have any new barrels that were worth like opening and putting grapes and the juice into to kind of impact the wine because I couldn't afford to buy new barrels. So we were trying to find a way to make a fermentation happen in a clean, kind of safe way to make the best wine we could, given kind of the limitations of our program. And we just used the picking bins. So many of you who have been out to Napa, and maybe those of you that have other industries, everything from like corn and tomatoes and all kinds of other like fruit and vegetable industries use these big like picking bins. And you can clean them up so they're really nice, and you can, crush grapes, put them in there, add your yeast culture, and away you go. And that's how we started. Excuse me. That's how we started. From there, it took quite a few years until we actually grew our production until it was large enough where it's like, oh yeah, maybe a stainless steel tank would be advantageous. Maybe we should do some barrel fermentations. But by that point, we had already been making wine a certain way, and that certainly influences the overall style of our wine and kind of where it ends up. So yes, we are fairly old school where we use these macro bins that are what we use for picking. Actually, we use the ones for picking are kind of the smaller ones. We use a couple of the 1 ton or 3/4 ton basically bins that allow us to do a little bit of a larger volume of a fermentation. And we do have lids for them, so we cover them up at night. But outside of that, they're in essence like an open top. They don't really seal, and we don't want them to because they're off-gassing a lot of heat, a lot of carbon dioxide. So you need that to kind of release and get out of the way. Otherwise, containers that are under pressure tend to stay under pressure. That can cause all kinds of messiness if you open up something that's got a lot of pressure to it. And that's just kind of how we've done it. It's a little more old school, it's not quite like some of the older like Greek, Italian, places that have been around for centuries where they're using like the concrete vats or like the clay amphora that they bury in the ground. But those would be like other options, right? There's all kinds of ways to make wine. And, stainless steel, for example, I don't even know when like macro bins became prevalent for like harvesting crops. But stainless steel wasn't even prevalent in winemaking until the 70s. So stainless steel has only been used for like 50 years when it comes to winemaking. Believe it or not, it has not been around that long. Barrels and like bigger casks made out of wood were really how it was done, or using the clay amphoras or larger like concrete vats and things. Those have really been kind of the more popular methods. These bins are neutral. They're not they're neutral. They're not imparting any characteristics. They're very similar to stainless steel in that sense. They are open top, so we can do our punch downs and kind of mix up those fermentations by hand and kind of do a little bit of that manual labor, which I personally really, really like and prefer if I can do these smaller batch fermentations. It's just stylistically, I think it adds a lot to the wine and creates a lot more kind of complexity and X factors to the wine. So at a certain point, it just came to a stylistic consideration and like, oh, this is how we do it. This is how we've been doing it. The wines have turned out really good as a result. Why try and fix something that's not broken? So that's really the biggest reason we don't use a lot of stainless steel or barrels. We do some barrel fermentations almost every year. We do some fermentations stainless every year, but the overwhelming majority of what we do, especially when it comes to our reds, will be in these kind of smaller batch, fermentations that are, in essence, open top that we can do these punch downs with, because stylistically that kind of leans toward what we're trying to do. So it was something we kind of did out of necessity in the early days, and it turned out that the wines that we made in that style were just yummy. So we continue running with it, kind of plain and simple. Yep. All right. Well, I think we got time. We got time for one more. Yeah, this is a good harvest question as well to kind of, round things out. So let's get into question number 5 real quick like. All right, when deciding to harvest, what are the main factors you are looking for? How do you decide when grapes are ready? The short answer, I walk out into the vineyard and I eat grapes, and based on what they taste like, based on what they look like, I know whether or not they're ready. That is the honest to goodness truth. That is how I decide to harvest. It's interesting this year, the Cabernet vineyard that have been buying from for some time now, for 4 years. They are selling, like, we're buying half and then there's another buyer for the other half of the vineyard in terms of the fruit that's coming off of it. And they're a little bit more scientific. Like, they went out there yesterday as I'm recording this and ran a full round of numbers between the acidity level, the pH, glucose, and fructose. I think did they show tannin on there? What else did they show? They showed malic acid. They did a big run of numbers to be like, hey, here's where the fruit's at, which I appreciate. That's good to see. The numbers were interesting, but I'm going to walk out there tomorrow. That's going to be on September 26th, Thursday, or maybe first thing on Friday, the 27th. And I'm going to walk through that vineyard and just eat grapes. Like, I now know where the numbers are this week. I don't need to test them every day because that's not how I do things. And just based on what I'm tasting, that'll tell me whether or not things are ready. I'm going to be looking at all kinds of stuff. When I bite and kind of chew up the grapes, are the tannins really rough and really green? Are they softer? And how sweet are the grapes? Are the seeds still green, or are they lignifying and kind of turning brown? If I crush up a cluster of grapes in like a little bucket, do I see a lot of color extraction? Do I see the skins kind of break down and that juice turn pretty purple pretty fast, or does it stay kind of like this pinkish color? I'm looking at the vines themselves. Are the canes starting to lignify, and turn brown? And, there's a lot of little things kind of physiologically that I look at, but when it comes down to it, it's the taste and the feel of the grapes themselves and the juice and kind of where it's at. Because based on the numbers I saw, I'm like, oh, this means that this fruit's probably still pretty green, even though the sugar's in a pretty good range. All the other numbers were not where I would want them to be. And that, if I was going to do that, I'd be like, yeah, these are not in a good range. But if I go out there tomorrow or day after tomorrow and it tastes great and it's right where I want it to be, then it's like, all right, we got to get this fruit in as soon as possible so that we can kind of capture this great moment. The trick is that I tasted this vineyard a week ago and I went through and tried grapes and, ate them. And I was like, oh, this is at least, even with this heat we're experiencing, I'm like, this is 10 days away from me even making a decision. So we're talking like 2 weeks before we actually harvest. And right now I'm still holding true to that because that's just how those grapes were tasting. Like, there's no way that you're going to get that level of ripeness that quick. There's a very slim chance that you will, because, exceptions are always there to prove the rule, but it's unlikely. So that's why we go out and we do a lot of these vineyard visits. As we get closer to picking, we do it more often. So, at the beginning of the month, it's like, oh, I'm going to try this once and then I'm going to wait 2 weeks. And then it's like, ooh, I tried it again. Let's try it in 10 days. And now it's like, okay, I'm going to try it every 5 days and then maybe every 3 days if I have to. And then by that point, it's like, okay, we should have a good idea of when this fruit's going to be ready, and we can get all the equipment, barrels, everything else we need at the winery ready to go for harvest. So it's like, I appreciate the numbers. It's cool to see. Based on that, I now have kind of like an opinion of where this fruit's going to be, but I got to go out there and I got to eat some grapes and see what they taste like. And that's how I'll decide when we harvest. All right. That is a good of a stopping point as ever. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Again, be sure to check out our website, mtgawines.com. Head to our shop. For those of you in the Charlotte, Atlanta, and Tampa areas, snag those tickets while you can. We will see you out on the road this fall. Looking forward to it. Again, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a quick rating and review for the show wherever you're consuming your podcast. That'll be hugely helpful. And for any more information, for those of you in our wine club, or if you just want to check out what a wine club is all about, you can head to our website, again, mtgawines.com, for more information. Follow us on all of our socials. That's Instagram, The Book of Face, the social network formerly known as Twitter, and of course here on YouTube, at MTGA Wines will be the handle for all those, so we can provide more up-to-date harvest content, tasting notes, the podcast, of course, and all kinds of other good stuff. Have an excellent rest of your day, everybody, week, and we'll see you next time for a new episode of the Wind Up Podcast. Cheers.